I have a bit of a strange question for you. It's quite obvious, so I apologize in advance for how obvious it is. But when do we celebrate New Year's Day? What's the date? Thank you, January 1st. So it's interesting, good job. There's not a trick question. It's interesting that we celebrate January 1st and we think, well, that's just how New Year's Day is. And of course, it depends on who you ask when they celebrate New Year's Day. It depends on where we are. Different places celebrate New Year's Day in different ways. Certain parts of New Zealand, June 1st. In Thailand, there's a more religious-focused celebration that tends to be in mid-April. In Persian countries, has to do with the springtime, the beginning of spring, and that time of year. And for the Jews, it's always been in the fall. We know it as Rosh Hashanah, and they've always celebrated the Jewish New Year in the fall, which made perfect sense. Even before they called it Rosh Hashanah, even before they had a name for it, they celebrated the New Year at that time of year because that's what their world and their life revolved around. It was agriculture. And they did certain things at certain times of the year, and in the fall was when everything started over again, and the cycle began. So when the fall time happened, it signaled to them, okay, the weather's doing something, and the moon is sort of doing something, and that means that we plant something and we gather something, and then the next thing we do is we plant and we gather the next thing. And it was a whole sequence and a cycle that began right at that time of year because it just made sense to start fresh and to start new. In 1908, somebody made a really neat discovery that kind of confirmed all of this. Somebody was digging around in south of Jerusalem, and they found what they now call the Gezer calendar. And it was in the little town of Gezer, just south of Jerusalem. They found this, and this is from the time of Solomon, King Solomon. I mean, like 10 centuries before the birth of Jesus, this thing was chiseled, and this was their calendar. It was a description of how their year went. I mean, it doesn't have dates on it. It just has these descriptions. And so here's what the description said. It said 2 months gathering, 2 months planting, month by month through the year. And so people were able to figure out, oh, okay, that's at this time of year, and that's this month. That's what corresponds to our month. So as they found this, they realized, well, it really is true. Their new year really was right at the beginning up there in the October-November timeframe. That's when their new year was. And so from that time on, I mean, we know the new year feelings. It's like we're kind of starting over. We make New Year's resolutions sometimes. We look on the past year and think, okay, that happened and it's done, and now we're starting again. There's all those just resetting, restarting, things are fresh and new, we're going to try again sort of feelings. God said to the people in the time of the Exodus something about their calendar and about their new year. Take a look at this. This is from Exodus chapter 12. While the Israelites were still in the land of Egypt, the Lord gave the following instructions to Moses and Aaron. From now on, this month will be the first month of the year for you. Why do they need a new year? I mean, the old one was just fine, wasn't it? I mean, it made sense. It signaled the new season and the new planting schedule and the new harvesting, and it signaled when they wore certain clothes and when they did things differently. I mean, it worked just fine. And there was nothing wrong with it. It wasn't broken. It wasn't inaccurate. It didn't cause any issues. It was perfectly fine for a new year. But God said, we're going to change this. And rather than your new year starting here, now we're going to start your new year here. Because God realized that God wanted their new year thoughts and celebrations and plans and ideas to not just be centered on what it was before. God was doing a new thing, and God said, I want your whole year, your whole schedule, your whole routine, the whole way you think about how your life goes, I want it to be centered on me. I'm doing something so big that it is starting over for you. So your new year is now starting here. This whole thing that God does of kind of resetting their whole schedule, reshaping their lives, it's so neat because it teaches us things about God, about ourselves, and how our lives can be shaped as we try to follow God. It helps a little bit in this, before we get further, to just get our bearings for where Moses is and where the people are in Egypt, because a lot has happened since we last left off with Moses. If you were with us last week, if you've been tracking with where we are, we're kind of skipping through Moses and the people of Israel. Where we left them off was that God had told Moses, and now Aaron, to go to Pharaoh and to go to the people of Israel. Their job was to go to the Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And their job was to go to the Israelites to say, trust that God is rescuing you. Now, Moses wasn't feeling too confident about this, so God gave Moses several signs and wonders with his staff and with his hand and with the Nile and other things, so that he could prove to them, both the people of Israel and Pharaoh, that God was worthy of their trust and that God was powerful enough to do this. So Moses went to them. The people were tired of believing, and Pharaoh said no yet again. And so we have this sequence that happens again. After that, we begin the season of the plagues, the 10 plagues. And Moses starts off with turning the Nile River into blood so that it can provide no life for the people. And Pharaoh's response is to have a hard heart. And he says, no, I will not let your people go. So Moses brings an infestation of frogs in the land, and the frogs go everywhere. And Pharaoh desperately cries out to Moses to take the frogs away. And Moses says, if you'll let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I will. And Moses says, okay, let's get the frogs out of here. And he does. And Pharaoh says, everything's good again. Your people can't go. And on and on this cycle goes with flies and locusts and with lightning and hail and with livestock that fall ill, with boils on people's skins. I mean, with all these crazy plagues that happen. And time and again, Pharaoh's heart resists letting the people go. Finally, there's the last terrible plague, the one that God pronounces that the firstborn sons in all the land of Egypt of the Egyptian people will no longer live at midnight that night. Now, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, their people will be unscathed. Their children will be perfectly fine. They will be untouched by this if they do some certain things, if they show that they are truly people who follow God. And this is where God gives them a few steps. God says, hey, I'm instituting a new year. We're going to start fresh because I'm doing this new thing. But here's what I want you to do in order to show that you are my people and you are willing to follow me as I lead you out of Egypt. So this is the new year moment, and this is the time when God is starting something fresh with the people and showing them what it looks like to have sort of a reshaped life in following God. So look at the passage once again for step one that we just looked at before. There are four kind of steps that God gives them. First one, while the Israelites were still in the land of Egypt, the Lord gave the following instructions to Moses and Aaron. Where were they? Egypt. How long had they been in Egypt? A very long time. Where were they hoping to go someday? The Promised Land. But where were they still? In Egypt. They hadn't moved anywhere. They were still in the same spot. God had not yet rescued them. God had not yet delivered them. They were still right where they were. And even though God says, from now on, we're starting here and some new things are going to happen, it hadn't happened yet. They weren't celebrating what God had already done. They were getting prepared for what God was going to do. We're really good at celebrating things that happen. We love celebrating things that already happen. The end of a tough journey or the end of something that's been difficult or the end of a season. We celebrate and we look back. They were not looking back. God was saying, I'm going to do something, so get ready, be prepared, because now I'm going to lead you out. So much of following God is so often preparing for what God is going to do. And that's the thing that builds our trust. That's the thing that builds our faith and challenges us to say, I'm not just celebrating what I've already seen. I am trusting, I'm having faith, grounded in what God has done, that God will continue and that God will do a new work. I mean, this is why we do all the stuff we do. I mean, this is why we pray. This is why we read the Bible. This is why we develop relationships with each other, because we need this stuff in order to prepare us to then trust what God is going to do. We don't, if you're like me, you don't have that trust already. It doesn't come naturally. We need resources beyond ourselves to be able to have the trust and faith to be prepared for what God will do ahead. God continues to give him some more instructions about what to do as God is instituting this new year and this new plan. Here's the next set of instructions. Announce to the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice, one animal for each household. If a family is too small to eat a whole animal, let them share with another family in the neighborhood. Divide the animal according to the size of each family and how much they can eat. The animal you select must be a 1-year-old male, either a sheep or a goat with no defects. Why did God ask them to get a sheep or a goat? Nearly everybody had a sheep or a goat. People did not all have cattle. People did not all have oxen. People did not all have other animals. And God certainly could have chosen a pigeon or a rabbit or anything else, but God chose a lamb or a goat because everybody had one. God was inviting, God was making it possible for everybody to participate in this. Because as we learn throughout Scripture, God invites us, not because of who we are, but because of who God is, to join in a relationship with God. God made it possible for anyone to participate because everybody can have a lamb or a goat. They've all got them available. And that allows them to join in what God is about to do. There are a couple other requirements. There's a 1-year-old requirement. It should be about 1. And that's just probably because they were old enough and big enough to supply the needs of the family or the group with that animal. They also said the lamb or the goat has to be without defects. God said, I want it to be perfect. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be admirable. I want it to be an animal you wouldn't already plan to just get rid of. Because if we already plan to get rid of the animal, there's no sacrifice there. If it's an animal we love and we prize and we value, then it takes some faith to be able to dedicate that to God, because we have to trust that God can provide for us. So they offer this, and they choose, and God says, I want you all to be in and part of this. God gives some more instructions about some more things that they need to do. Take special care of this chosen animal until the evening of the 14th day of this first month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel must slaughter their lamb or young goat at twilight. They are to take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the animal. On that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But the blood on your doorposts will serve as a sign, marking the houses where you are staying. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. This plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. It's interesting, when the people of Israel moved into the land of Egypt, hundreds of years before this, with Joseph bringing the people in, they were used to living in tents. They were nomadic people. They were transients, roaming throughout the land. They didn't tend to build stone houses. But when they got to Egypt, everything was different. And over the generations that they were in Egypt, they learned to build houses. And they realized, we're going to be here a while. So they settled and they built these houses. They learned this from the Egyptians and they became so much a part of their world. So many places in that area have been excavated and they found these homes. And as they built these homes, they always needed, like we do, to indicate where they live. You know, if you're having somebody over for dinner or if you're having somebody over to visit, in order for them to find your house, you can give them directions, but you also give them what in order to find your house? Yeah, you give them your address. I live at 3142 West Payson. Oh, okay, well, I can look that up. And I can see that on your house, that number, and so I know where I am. They didn't have number addresses. They had name addresses. They would all write their names on their houses. That's what indicated that it was your house. So, you know, you'd write Deb, or you'd write Elaine, or you'd write John. You'd write your name on your house. But they also wanted it to last, so they would actually chisel it into rock. Because, you know, rock can last longer than wood or straw or other materials. So they would actually chisel it into rocks, and they would put the rocks on the door frames of their houses. The top, the sides, and they would also do all sorts of things because the Egyptians believed, their world that they were living in believed, that the more places you put your name, the longer your name will last into eternity. So people built like rooms, and people built monuments, and people built gardens, and they built all these different things where they would chisel their names. So, I mean, you'd have your name all over your house and your property and everywhere you were. The more times, the better, because you would be able to, they believed, last into eternity. The more times, the longer into eternity. When God said, I want you to sacrifice the lamb, I want you to take the blood and spread it on your doorposts, they were covering up their names. Because God was saying, it's not your name that's going to make you last. It's me who's going to make you last. We're not going to last forever. And this was a chance for God to say to them, rely on me to last forever. Don't rely on yourself to last forever. I love that verse in Paul's letter to the Galatians. I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who lives. It's not my name that lives. It's Christ living in me. Their name was replaced by the blood that we see was just a perfect sacrifice in the life of Jesus, so that people could trust that God was the one who was going to lead them into eternity. God gives them one more set of instructions after this. God says, that same night, they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. This is where we start talking about the bread. And the bread just keeps coming up more and more times. So there's more to that. The Israelites took their bread dough before yeast was added. They wrapped their kneading boards in their cloaks and carried them on their shoulders. All of this practice of the bread and taking the bread with them, this was the beginning of that perpetual annual celebration that became named the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. The Jews have celebrated for years, every year since they came into the Promised Land. They have kept this habit because this moment, this bread, there's something about it that was so iconic. And Moses had to say something else to them also about this whole practice of the bread. These are your instructions for eating this meal. Be fully dressed, wear your sandals, carry your walking stick in your hand, eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. I mean, this is like, I'm halfway out the door, I got my coat on, and I'm just eating my meal, waiting for what's going to happen next. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I got to be ready. There was this urgency, you don't know when, but in a moment, you just got to start running. I mean, there was no time to waste. There was no time to lounge and relax at a meal and talk with your family and friends. This was time to get ready for what was happening. The feeling of that immediacy matched the immediacy of what God was going to do with their salvation and rescue. This urgent feeling, this urgency that they felt and had was to match the urgency of relying and trusting on what God was going to do. This bread that wasn't yet baked, this bread that normally they were used to bread that had risen and baked over time, this bread that didn't take any of that time reminded them that we got to trust that God's going to provide for us on a journey that we are not prepared at all for. This was pushing them out the door because God was passing over. This whole event is called the Passover. The word Passover that they use, it literally means to pass over, to skip over, as skip over their houses. It also means to protect and to have compassion. God was protecting them, clearly, and God was having compassion to rescue them out of where they were as God was passing over them. These four things weren't just interesting objects and interesting habits. These four things were pointing to a reshaped life that God wanted these people to have starting then. And for us to have a continually reshaped life as we strive to follow God. The location was about being prepared in advance for what God was going to do. The lamb was that everybody gets invited to this. The blood was that we can't last on our own. And the bread was to depend on God to provide for where we're going in our future and what's going to happen. It's certainly no accident that the focus of the Gospels and the most that we know about Jesus' life was during the Passover week. Because Jesus' life mirrored this in so many ways. And Jesus was the one who, not just like they were saved and rescued, Jesus' life saves and rescues. God's story of starting fresh was replicated again in Jesus starting fresh. And our lives can be reshaped not only by God releasing them from Egypt, but by Jesus releasing us from the places that we find ourselves. A few questions. These can be to ponder, these can be to discuss, these can be to journal about, these can be for you to ruminate on. A few questions. When has God reshaped some of my life routines? When has God done some reshaping of my life? What patterns is God reshaping in you right now? Right now. Which of the four Passover steps stands out to you today? Because they all mean something. They all indicate something and point to something. Which one just stands out to me today? May this work of God rescuing them also be this work of God rescuing us. Would you pray with me?